Jesus, I mean, you guys do nothing but complain about how you can't stand it in this place here, and then you haven't got the guts just to walk out? How do you think you are, for Christ's sake, crazy or something? Well, you're not.
Jack Nicholson once revealed that what fans saw on screen was only half the madness. Behind One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a real hospital, real patients, CIA substance experiments, actors breaking down, and a villain so terrifying even her co-stars avoided her off-set.
We were in the Oregon State Mental Hospital, right, which was an active hospital, was that we would have patients working behind the scene in the film. I just didn't know that they were criminally insane.
The film won Oscars, but it also sparked scandal, divided psychiatrists, and haunted the people who made it. What secrets have been hiding for nearly 50 years? Let's discover. The film that became a real asylum. The truth is simple and shocking. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was not just filmed inside a psychiatric hospital, it was lived there. The movie you think you know was shot in real wards with real patients, and the line between performance and reality was erased until even the actors struggled to tell which was which. Jack Nicholson himself admitted that by the end of the shoot, he felt halfway institutionalized. This was not Hollywood fakery. It was a controlled psychological experiment that swallowed its cast whole. So what really happened inside Oregon State Hospital? Why did Nicholson later say the production got into his head in ways no other role ever had? And what did fans never figure out about how this movie blurred the line between art and madness? The decision to film Cuckoo's Nest in Oregon was about creating an environment that would press down on everyone involved until they absorbed the weight of the institution. The hospital was not a set. It was a working psychiatric facility with its own staff, patients, routines, and ghosts of decades past. The sterile day rooms, the chipped linoleum floors, the smell of antiseptic in the air. These were the living, breathing environment where real people spent years of their lives under psychiatric care. By walking into those halls with cameras rolling, the filmmakers were stepping into a functioning world of confinement and control. The walls carried history, and the actors found themselves immersed in it, whether they wanted to be or not. One of the most unusual conditions of filming came from Dr. Dean Brooks, the superintendent of Oregon State Hospital. Brooks was no ordinary consultant. He believed that if a film was to tell the truth about mental institutions, it could not do so with Hollywood pretending. He insisted that actual psychiatric patients should be part of the production, not just as background figures glimpsed in a corridor, but as extras, assistants, and even crew members. Around 80 patients worked on the film. This meant that when Nicholson and his co-stars gathered for group therapy scenes or milled around in the day room, the people sitting in the chairs next to them were patients whose medical charts were stored in the hospital office down the hall. Their gestures, their mannerisms, their silence or their outbursts were reality captured by a camera. This integration went far beyond novelty. For the cast, it created a constant state of uncertainty. When an actor delivered a line, the person across from them might respond with something scripted or with something real that came from their own mental state. Improvisation sessions were held where actors and patients were deliberately mingled, and sometimes even the staff could not immediately tell which new faces were professionals and which were residents. Director Milos Forman later admitted he relied on these sessions to gauge authenticity. If the patients accepted an actor as one of their own, Forman knew he had found the right person for the part. What does it mean when the line between role play and genuine illness becomes so faint that even trained doctors can no longer distinguish between them? For Nicholson and his castmates, it meant that every day they risked losing the ability to fully separate themselves from the world they were depicting. Nicholson did not enter this environment as a detached star. To prepare for the role of Randall McMurphy, he and the other main actors did something almost unthinkable in today's film industry. They lived inside the hospital wards. They did not retreat to comfortable trailers or nearby hotels after a day's work. They ate the same institutional food, followed the same schedules, and slept in the same quarters as the patients. They experienced the slam of the heavy metal doors closing at night, the buzz of the overhead lights that never quite disappeared, the sense of surveillance that never lifted. At first, it was an experiment in method acting, but quickly it became more than that. The hospital routine began to infiltrate their thoughts and behavior, a phenomenon that psychologists call situational influence, when the environment itself starts shaping how you think and feel. Danny DeVito, who played Martini, later admitted that after a few days of this immersion, he and others began to feel institutionalized. The monotony of the schedule, the locked doors, and the rigid routines chipped away at their sense of autonomy. This is the precise effect psychiatric hospitals had on patients in that era, reducing individuality until conformity was the only option. The actors felt it firsthand, not as research, but as lived experience. For Nicholson, the impact was profound. He later described feeling halfway institutionalized, a phrase that reveals just how deeply the role and the setting had taken root inside him. When a performer of Nicholson's intensity admits to being psychologically affected by a set, it raises the question, how much of his unforgettable performance as McMurphy was acting, and how much was a genuine breakdown under pressure? The blurring of lines reached its peak in the group therapy and basketball scenes. Watch closely, and you will see subtle differences. Some faces in the background respond a half-beat later than the rest. Some movements seem slightly off. Some eyes dart around the room with a different kind of confusion. These are not rehearsed performances. These are the real patients of Oregon State Hospital, caught on film as themselves. Nicholson and his co-stars were not merely pretending to be surrounded by the mentally ill. They were actually surrounded by them. When McMurphy leads a game in the yard, part of the power of that scene comes from the fact that not everyone there knew they were in a movie. Some thought they were just participating in another ward activity, filmed by outsiders for reasons not entirely clear to them. Nicholson, reflecting years later, suggested that this environment shaped his performance more than any rehearsal ever could. He explained that once he started living under the hospital's rules, McMurphy's defiance came naturally because it was his own defiance against the system closing in on him. When he banged on doors, shouted at nurses, or rallied his fellow patients, he was expressing his own frustration at being confined. What fans never realized was that the film's authenticity came from the dangerous decision to make the actors live as though they were institutionalized. Nicholson was not exaggerating when he said he felt halfway institutionalized. He was describing a psychological reality created by the production itself. This was submission to an environment until it reshaped the mind. And that is why the performance at the center of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest feels so disturbingly real, because in many ways, it was the psychedelic secret behind Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is one of those rare works of fiction that feels like it could only have been written by someone who had lived inside the walls of an asylum, who had felt the oppressive silence of a ward, and who had seen the constant power struggle between staff and patients. That uncanny realism is not accidental. Kesey was not merely imagining what life inside a psychiatric hospital might be like. He had worked the night shift in one. In the early 1960s, while attending Stanford University, he took a job as a night aide at Menlo Park Veterans Hospital. It was here that he observed patients in their quiet hours, listened to their fragmented conversations, and witnessed treatments that were routine then, but controversial now. electroshock therapy, heavy sedation, and the daily enforcement of strict institutional routines. These observations would form the skeleton of his novel, but something else, something far stranger, furnished the skin and blood of the story. Because at the very same time, Kesey was also volunteering for a classified government program that would later become infamous, the CIA's MKUltra experiments. These projects, hidden under layers of secrecy during the Cold War, were designed to test whether mind-altering substance could be used for interrogation, control, or even psychological warfare. Kesey, along with dozens of other unsuspecting young men and women, signed up for what he thought was a scientific study on psychoactive substances. He was dosed with psilocybin, mescaline, and other hallucinogens, sometimes in carefully monitored settings, and sometimes in ways that today would be considered unethical. For Kesey, however, the experience was revelatory rather than terrifying. He began to see the hospital, its staff, and its patients through altered states of consciousness, and this new perspective would shape the surreal, paranoid energy that runs through every page of Cuckoo's Nest. What does it mean when the foundations of a literary classic are built not just on observation, but on chemically altered perception? To understand the answer, we have to look at how LSD and similar hallucinogens affect the mind. These substances disrupt the normal patterns of communication between neurons, loosening the brain's grip on consensus reality and heightening sensations of interconnectedness, distortion, and paranoia. Under their influence, the ordinary world can seem like a series of layered symbols, and authority figures can appear as threatening agents of control. For Kesey, who was already immersed in an environment where doctors held absolute power over patients, where individuals could be medicated, restrained, or even lobotomized against their will, the hallucinogens made the imbalance of power not only visible, but almost unbearably vivid. The result was a novel in which reality itself seemed unstable, narrated through a voice that blended psychosis with insight. That voice belonged to Chief Bromden, the half-Native American patient who pretends to be deaf and mute but secretly observes everything in the ward. The decision to tell the story through Chief's eyes was revolutionary. It meant that the narrative was filtered through layers of paranoia, hallucination, and distortion. Bromden describes the hospital as controlled by a vast, mechanical system he calls the Combine, a metaphor that blends industrial machinery with a faceless bureaucracy. To a reader, the Combine can be understood as the machinery of American conformity in the 1950s and 1960s, but it also reflects the kind of psychedelic imagery Kesey was immersed in, the sensation that invisible systems are running the world, manipulating individuals, and crushing individuality. The Chief's visions of fog machines and hidden wires may sound fantastical, but they are rooted in the altered perception that generates. What some critics dismissed as madness was in fact a literary rendering of what Kesey himself had felt under the influence of government-supplied psychedelics. It is no coincidence that paranoia and surveillance are central to Cuckoo's Nest. The early 1960s were an age of Cold War secrecy, nuclear standoffs, and fears of communist infiltration. The CIA's own interest in was motivated by the belief that minds could be controlled and secrets extracted under chemical duress. In that context, Kesey's novel reads not only as an allegory of a mental hospital, but as a critique of a society obsessed with control and manipulation. The patients are not just mentally ill, they are stand-ins for every citizen caught in a system where individuality is suppressed for the sake of order. The staff, with their routines and authority, become symbols of governments and institutions that claim to act in the name of stability but operate through domination. Yet despite the power of his vision, Kesey would come to reject the film adaptation that made his novel world famous. His primary objection was that the filmmakers abandoned Chief Bromden's point of view. To Kesey, this was not just a narrative choice, it was the heart of the story. Without Bromden's hallucinatory lens, the novel's meaning shifted from a critique of systems of control to a character-driven clash between McMurphy and Nurse Ratched. The paranoia, the fog, the metaphor of the Combine, all of this was stripped away in favor of a more straightforward battle of wills. For Kesey, that was unforgivable. He famously refused to watch the finished movie, claiming that he wanted nothing to do with it once the narrative voice was lost. Jack Nicholson would later reflect on this tension by saying that Kesey's tragedy was that he gave birth to a story that became everyone else's. In other words, once the film succeeded, the story was no longer Kesey's alone. It belonged to audiences, to actors, to directors, and to the culture that embraced it. The original psychedelic perspective of the novel was drowned out by the iconic performances and cinematic imagery of the adaptation. What most fans never figured out is that the movie they love is built on a foundation that was heavily shaped by Cold War substance experiments, hallucinatory perceptions, and the paranoia of surveillance culture. The DNA of Cuckoo's Nest is not just literary, it is pharmacological and political. But here is a question worth asking. Would the novel have been possible without and MK Ultra? Could Kesey have written such a disturbing, vivid account of control and rebellion if he had only observed patients clinically? The answer is almost certainly no. Kesey's altered perception allowed him to empathize with patients in ways that a sober observer could not. He could feel the fog of medication, the disorientation of enforced routine, and the suspicion that authority figures were not healers, but jailers. By combining these sensations with the tangible details of hospital life, he produced a work that straddled the line between realism and hallucination. It is precisely this duality that gives the novel its enduring power. When we consider the cultural impact of Cuckoo's Nest, it is important to remember that it emerged from a very specific historical moment. In the United States of the early 1960s, conformity was prized, psychiatric hospitals were overflowing, and the government was secretly running experiments on its own citizens. Kesey, standing at the intersection of all three, produced a novel that revealed what happens when individuals are crushed by institutions. That is why the book still resonates today, and why the film, despite its brilliance, can never fully capture the strangeness of the original vision. Nicholson was right. The tragedy for Kesey was losing ownership of his own story. But for the rest of us, the revelation is clear. The film we admire rests on foundations that were far more radical and unsettling than most viewers ever realized. To understand One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is to understand that its DNA is stitched together from the Cold War's darkest experiments, the chemical dreams of and the voice of a man who saw in paranoia the deepest truth of his age. Nicholson, Breakdown, and Onset Warfare. Jack Nicholson's approach to Randall McMurphy was so consuming that even the hospital staff began to confuse the man with the role. Nurses and orderlies who had worked with real patients for years admitted that they sometimes forgot Nicholson was an actor, because his behavior, his language, and even his posture blended seamlessly into the institutional environment. This was not simply a matter of skilled acting, it was the effect of method performance taken to its extreme, and it created a dangerous feedback loop where the set fed the performance, and the performance fed the actor's state of mind. But what happens when an actor's immersion becomes so convincing that it unsettles not just the audience, but the people making the film alongside him? One of the earliest cracks to appear in this fragile experiment involved Sidney Lassick, who played the anxious and childlike Cheswick. Lassick was known for his nervous energy and his ability to portray vulnerability, but during filming, he began to lose control of those emotions off camera. In one instance, he broke down crying so uncontrollably that the production had to pause, and the hospital staff themselves became concerned that he might harm himself. His friends among the cast described him as overwhelmed by the intensity of the environment, where every day demanded he relive the anxieties of his character. The line between actor and role had blurred so deeply that even trained professionals could not be sure whether they were dealing with a performance or a genuine breakdown. Brad Dourif, who portrayed Billy Bibbit, experienced something similar but in a quieter, more unsettling way. Dourif's character was a young man crippled by stuttering, shame, and fear of authority, and his fragile presence gave the film some of its most heartbreaking scenes. But Dourif admitted that he sometimes could not turn Billy off when the cameras stopped rolling. He would continue trembling off-camera, staying in character between takes, as though the institution itself refused to release him from its grip. Colleagues recalled moments when he seemed consumed by the role, unable to separate himself from Billy's terror and despair. When the hospital staff noticed his behavior, they suggested he sleep outside the ward to regain some distance, a telling sign that even the professionals feared the performance had crossed into personal damage. Danny DeVito, playing the gentle Martini, put it bluntly when he later said that the locked doors and routines began to make the cast feel institutionalized themselves. While Nicholson thrived on channeling this immersion into defiance, others like Lassick and Dourif internalized it differently, with their nervous systems bearing the strain. This divergence among the cast reflected a larger clash in the film's production. The different ways individuals handled the psychological experiment they had been pulled into. Louise Fletcher added another layer of tension by making a deliberate choice to distance herself from the camaraderie of the male cast. Unlike Nicholson and the others who bonded during their shared experience in the wards, Fletcher avoided socializing, stayed in separate accommodations, and remained aloof between scenes. She explained later that she wanted to maintain the cold authority of Nurse Ratched, ensuring that her co-stars felt a real sense of unease around her. The result was a form of psychological warfare that extended beyond the screen. The men did not simply act intimidated by her, they felt it in their bones, because Fletcher refused to give them relief from her character's oppressive presence. Danny DeVito remembered that when Fletcher walked into the room in costume, with her hair immaculate and her smile carefully restrained, the cast often fell silent. What looks like controlled hostility on screen was not fully staged. It was born from her calculated decision to unsettle her colleagues in real life. This strategy worked brilliantly for the film, but it contributed to an atmosphere of strain that Nicholson himself later admitted was palpable. He thrived on confrontation, and his own clashes with director Milos Forman became part of the film's behind-the-scenes drama. Nicholson was a method-driven actor who relied on intensity and total immersion, whereas Forman, shaped by his European filmmaking background, often preferred a looser, more observational approach. Forman gave his actors space to find their own rhythm, but Nicholson wanted more guidance and at times bristled at what he saw as detachment. Their disagreements were not simply about style, they reflected two fundamentally different philosophies of art. Nicholson wanted to wrestle with the material until it broke open, while Forman believed in shaping the environment and letting the truth emerge organically. This conflict created friction on set, with Nicholson sometimes challenging Forman directly, pushing back against instructions or improvising in ways that stretched the director's patience. And yet, that very tension between actor and director, between immersion and restraint, became part of the energy of the film itself. The push and pull between Nicholson's raw rebellion and Forman's measured control mirrored the very themes of the story, the individual battling against the authority of an institution. Nicholson later reflected on this period with striking honesty, saying, "What people saw on screen was only half of what happened. The madness infected us." It was a confession that the production did not merely represent madness, but in some sense generated it. The clashes between actors and director, between characters and their performers, and between immersion and sanity left scars that lingered long after filming ended. The cost of authenticity was high. Some of the cast walked away shaken. Some struggled to separate themselves from roles that had cut too deeply. And even Nicholson admitted that the atmosphere infected them in ways no one had expected. The brilliance of the performances that made the film a cultural landmark came at a price, and behind every iconic scene lies the invisible weight of the breakdowns, clashes, and psychological battles that made One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest one of the most unsettling productions in Hollywood history. Controversy, scandal, and cultural aftermath. When One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was released in 1975, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics praised it as a daring work of art. Audiences lined up to see it, and within months, it had become one of the most talked-about films of the decade. It swept the Academy Awards, taking home the so-called Big Five trophies of Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay, a feat that had only happened twice before in Hollywood history. On the surface, it looked like a unanimous triumph, but beneath the celebrations, a far more complex reaction was building. How could a film be embraced as both a masterpiece of empathy and accused of reinforcing some of the cruelest stereotypes about mental illness? Part of the controversy came from the way the film depicted psychiatric treatment. Scenes of electroconvulsive therapy were portrayed not as carefully monitored procedures, but as violent punishment inflicted on patients who resisted authority. The lobotomy of McMurphy at the end was shown as an act of institutional cruelty designed to destroy rebellion rather than to heal illness. Mental health professionals at the time argued that these images, while powerful, exaggerated reality in a way that exploited suffering for dramatic effect. The American Psychiatric Association criticized the film for portraying hospitals as prisons and doctors as sadists, warning that the public might come to fear treatment rather than seek it. Their concern was not unfounded, because countless viewers admitted afterward that the film had shaped their understanding of psychiatry more than any real-world information ever had. But another camp argued the opposite, that by showing the institutional environment as oppressive, the film encouraged audiences to empathize with patients who had been silenced or dismissed. The question of whether the film humanized or stigmatized the mentally ill became a heated debate in the late 1970s, with critics, psychologists, and politicians weighing in. Some saw it as an overdue exposure of abuse in institutions, while others believed it reinforced the stereotype that madness was chaotic, childlike, and uncontrollable. The fact that the same film could be read in such different ways only heightened its notoriety. The feminist response added another layer of conflict. Nurse Ratched became one of the most infamous villains in American cinema, but not everyone celebrated her as a brilliant character. Many feminist critics argued that she represented a misogynistic caricature of female power. In a decade when the women's movement was fighting to expand women's roles in society, Ratched was framed as a controlling, emasculating authority figure whose defeat brought catharsis to audiences. To them, the popularity of her character revealed how threatening society still found women who wielded power. Instead of creating space for complex portrayals of female authority, the film had given shape to the archetype of the cold, heartless woman who destroys men. Louise Fletcher herself admitted that after winning the Oscar, She found it difficult to escape the shadow of Ratched. People treated her as intimidating off-screen. Directors hesitated to cast her in sympathetic roles, and audiences recoiled from her as though she were the character herself. The performance was so convincing that it trapped the actress inside it. Meanwhile, Jack Nicholson's McMurphy had the opposite effect. He was embraced as a counterculture hero, the embodiment of rebellion against oppressive systems. His grin, his refusal to follow rules, his endless scheming against Ratched, all of this resonated with an America still raw from Vietnam and Watergate, a society disillusioned by authority figures who had failed them. For young audiences, Nicholson was not just playing McMurphy, he was a symbol of freedom, a man willing to go down fighting rather than surrender. This difference in reception between Nicholson and Fletcher only deepened the divide in how the film was remembered, as a celebration of defiance on one hand, and as a vilification of female control on the other. But perhaps the most significant cultural impact came not in Hollywood, but in mental health policy. By the time Cuckoo's Nest hit theaters, the process of deinstitutionalization was already underway. Across the United States, large psychiatric hospitals were being shut down, patients were being released into community care, and the old model of long-term institutionalization was collapsing. The film gave this movement a powerful emotional push. For many viewers, it was the first time they had seen the inside of an asylum, and what they saw confirmed their worst fears. Confinement stripped people of dignity, treatment looked like torture, and rebellion was crushed with surgical violence. Whether or not this was an accurate depiction mattered less than the fact that it resonated. The film became a cultural touchstone that fueled public distrust of psychiatric institutions, adding momentum to a process that was already transforming American mental health care. The shadow of this cultural moment has never fully lifted. Decades later, psychiatrists still debate whether Cuckoo's Nest helped or harmed public understanding of mental illness. Was it a film that gave patients a voice, or one that convinced people to avoid treatment at all costs? Feminist scholars still dissect Nurse Ratched's role, questioning whether she was a rare example of female authority or simply a reflection of male anxieties. And in the world of film, the Oscars' sweep secured its place in history. But the scars it left on the actors and the field of psychiatry remind us that art can never be separated from the consequences it creates. The brilliance of the movie lies in this very contradiction. It was adored and condemned, celebrated and feared, hailed as both revolutionary and regressive. Nicholson would become an icon of rebellion, while Fletcher would carry the burden of embodying one of the most despised women on screen. The institutions the film criticized would change forever, but the stigma surrounding mental illness remained, proving that sometimes cultural revolutions leave behind victories that are incomplete. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.